Let's take a look at how Linux stores user account information. We'll specifically take a look at two important files, the password file and the shadow file. So we are in our Linux terminal. Doesn't matter what Linux version it is. Everyone's going to have the /etc password. If I just cat /etc/password, here I can see user accounts. At the very bottom, I've got my Ubuntu user account. That's what I'm logged in with right now, the Ubuntu user. If I scroll up, I've got the root account. Lots of user accounts here are not really, well, lots of accounts here are not for users. They're for system processes and things. Stuff that Linux uses in the background to run stuff like the SSHD that can be used to run the SSH service that just listens for connections. Notice here there's no passwords. We just have usernames. We have some other data, but there is no password in this file. So it should look very similar. We can try to look at the file that stores the password. It's the shadow file. So if I cat /etc/shadow, it says permission denied. Well, that kind of makes sense. We don't want people poking around and looking at passwords. So how do we do that? We, the Ubuntu user, have sudo permissions. So we will sudo cat etc shadow. And Interestingly, we don't see passwords here like we traditionally would. Why don't we have a password? So like, think about when you logged into this machine. Why didn't you have to enter a password? Well, it's because we were using SSH certificates, key files, kind of as our password. So we'll add some data here. We'll add a user account that's not using certificates to authenticate. We'll just use regular passwords. So let's go ahead and add an account. We'll check out the shadow file in a bit and we'll see that those passwords will show up there, but they'll show up in a different format, not clear text. It'll look something like what we see here in that user field. Okay, so I'm gonna sudo, because adding accounts, that's a administrative permission. So I'm gonna sudo user add Chris. No news is good news in the Linux world, but Chris has no password. So I'm going to change Chris's password with sudo passwd Chris. Yeah, they didn't want to spell out the whole word password for some reason. Have to give it a password. What should I'll make the password logger as instructed. LOGGER. Okay, so let's take a look. We can sudo cat /etc/shadow. So I didn't just edit this file, but by adding a user, Linux edited this file. So what do I see? I've got Chris here, and I don't see the word logger for this password here. Instead, this is a hash. This password has been hashed. Hashing is under the cryptography umbrella. It's not technically encryption, but uses some of the same algorithms behind the scenes. We've got some salt here to add some randomness into this password. So let's try to add another user account. Let's create another user named Pat with the password logger. So same command, sudo user add Pat sudo passwd Pat. New password logger. Retype new password logger. Password updated successfully. Let's check that shadow file. Sudo cat etc shadow. So I had two users and I set both of their passwords to the word logger. But if I look in this password, the file containing the passwords, the shadow file, the password field is different. The passwords don't appear to match. That's because Linux was smart here. Linux injected some salt or just some random data into this password hash to make it so that if two users use the same password, their hashes would be different. So passwords are protected. There's a couple of layers of protection here. Number one, you have to have administrative rights in order to even view the shadow file that contains those passwords. And even if you can view the shadow file, looking at it, you can't immediately make sense of what's going on here. We could try to crack these passwords, and we'll do that later when we look at different tools. But there's no way visually just to say, oh yeah, that's Chris, and this must mean the password logger. No, that's not going to happen. Let's clean up our users. So I'm going to sudo user del Pat and sudo user del Chris. Let's take a look at our password file and the shadow file. So if I cat /etc passwd, no Pat, no Chris. If I just hit the up arrow key a few times, sudo cat etc shadow, they're gone. They're out of my system. So as far as security is concerned, it's important to know what user accounts exist on our system. We want to make sure that they have good passwords. We want to make sure that people can authenticate, but we also want to make sure that we don't have accounts that are not needed anymore.